This is Data Malarkey, the podcast about using data smarter. Every organization is driven by data, but how can you turn it into powerful storytelling? By asking the right questions, discovering the insights, and building your data story. This is the podcast that talks to leaders and thinkers around the world about how they use data smarter, so you can too. Welcome to Data Malarkey.
Hello and welcome. I'm your host, Sam Knowles, and I'm really excited about our guest today. Joining us is Katherine Courtney, who is chair of the Steering Board of the Global Network on Sustainability in Space. Katherine has a significant career in business, public life and public service. And after a decade or so in telecoms and communication, Katherine had a series of high-profile civil service jobs at the Home Office, Departments of Work and Pensions, and Business, Innovation and Skills. In 2016, she became the chief executive of the UK Space Agency, and the final frontier has definitely remained a passion of hers and a diversion of hers ever since. Now, Katherine, first of all, welcome to the Data Malarkey podcast. Great to have you here.
Thank you, Sam. Thanks so much for inviting me.
Very good. Now, is there anything that you'd like to add? Is there anything I've got wrong in characterizing your work so far to date?
No, I think that's a better summary. I need to steal that for my 30-second bio. The only thing I would mention is that I also do a lot of work as a STEM ambassador, and I have a small charity called Primary Space, where I work with primary school teachers and classrooms, children, to try and help them get inspired and engaged with science, technology, engineering, math careers through interesting space jobs. So,
very, very good. I think we'll definitely talk a lot about space during the course of our time together today. Before we talk about data, and I know you've got a particular take about data and its memorableness and otherwise, but before we talk about data, let's go a bit beyond the CV. I'm interested in interesting questions, and I think this is an interesting question, and I want to ask you first of all a question that doesn't necessarily talk about or get you want to talk about your career. Tell me, Katherine, how do you spend your time?
That's a very good question. It's a whole lot less glamorous than my CV might lead people to believe. I have three very young children, 2 9-year-olds and a 12-year-old. So I spend an awful lot of my time spinning the plates that any working professional with 3 young children has to spin. And a lot of that is about providing a taxi service for their social engagements and, just trying to make sure that they get to school on time. Slightly more complicated at the moment because one of my twins has a broken leg. So that's just extra ambulance factor in the taxi service. But yeah, I spend most of my time just trying to pursue my passions around space sustainability and looking after all those domestic affairs. Yeah,
I trust one of your twins wasn't doing an impression of Buzz Lightyear bouncing off a beach ball and thinking they could fly.
No, sadly, it was a half-term ski break, and these things happen.
They do indeed. So tell me, what was it that first gave you a passion for space? Is it something that's been with you all your life, or is it something that came to you later? Tell me what gave you the passion for space.
I have to say it was pure luck. Pure luck. I was working at the Department for Business. I actually met my predecessor at the UK Space Agency a few months earlier and came home that evening and said to my husband, "Did you know the UK had a space agency?" And that was before Major Tim Peake had launched to the International Space Station, which I think put the UK Space Agency on the map for millions of Brits who may not have known much about it before then. And then I just happened to be in the right place at the right time. Dave Parker went on to a job at the European Space Agency and they needed a replacement. So I was asked to step in. And it was, just one of those happy coincidences that brought together lots of things I'd done previously in my career, but in a new sector that I knew absolutely nothing about. And I was bitten by the space bug from that point on.
So tell us, if you would, a bit about the organisation of which you now chair the steering board, the Global Network on Sustainability in Space. I think it seems two areas of the zeitgeist coming absolutely together.
Yeah, I mean, I could talk for an hour and a half about the importance of space to sustainability of life on Earth. That network is a network funded by the Science Technology Facilities Council, designed to bring together industry and academia to try and tackle the problems of that are facing the space environment. And we have got increasing challenges in space. When you think about humans have only been in space since the 1950s, but the pace of change has accelerated so much in the last decade that whereas, 20 years ago, there were a couple of thousand operational satellites up there. Now at latest count, it's almost 10,000. And it used to be that the space environment was really a matter for large institutions of science and defense, launching a few large assets up there that were owned by governments. Now, some 80 or 90% of the spacecraft up there in the man-made night sky are owned by commercial operators.
Not all of them Elon Musk.
Not all of them Elon Musk, but Elon Musk has certainly single-handedly driven through his SpaceX ventures and his Starlink constellation network this explosive growth in small satellites in orbit around the Earth, in near-Earth orbit. So space is becoming, as we will have seen with, for instance, Vladimir Putin's activities of the last few years, and Elon Musk's activities, it has become more congested, more contested, and more commercial. And for this reason, we find ourselves in a position where the world was with air travel and transport in, the post-war years, the previous war, and the previous big one, where actually there was a need for a global consensus and for people to come together and identify binding rules of the road for how we use space. And at the moment, what we have is a series of voluntary guidelines and standards and some long-running discussions in various UN committees, etc., around how to use space more sustainably. So, historically, rockets were designed as a series of exploding, huge tubes of metal, and those things were just left up there. And they fragment and disintegrate and bump into things. So the European Space Agency estimates now that there are over 130 million pieces of uncontrollable debris in space, and over 29,000 of them are big, so 10 centimeters in size, from the size of an orange or up to the size of a London bus. And if they're traveling around at 17,600, miles an hour, it's very difficult to understand the consequences of a major collision in space. So, so far, only a few nations, Russia the most recently, have demonstrated their ability to blow things up in space. And when Russia did that, I think it was at the end of 2021, they created a debris cloud of about 1,500 pieces of uncontrollable debris. Their own cosmonauts had to shelter in escape pods on the ISS because actually you can't control that stuff. Once it's flying around at that speed, it can create enormous damage. So debris is a big challenge. The sun also is not a very well understood phenomenon, and it occasionally throws out huge bursts of magnetic particles. It is, after all, just a huge sustained nuclear reaction, the sun. And that can interfere with critical infrastructure down here on Earth, but it can also make satellites inoperable, as Elon Musk himself experienced when about a batch of his 60 Starlink satellites went up and he lost control of 45 of them straight away because of an unexpected burp from the sun. So solar weather, that's something we don't understand enough about. Orbital capacity, we don't understand enough about it. And the rules of the road don't exist. So there's a huge amount of work to do. And that's what the Global Network on Sustainability in Space tries to do, is to bring researchers and innovators together to try and help accelerate progress towards solutions to those problems.
Fantastic. Beautifully described with contrary to what you were saying before, and maybe what you may say afterwards, a broad array of data points, not beautifully contextualized from the size of the orange to the size of the London bus. Tell me, what role does data play in your day-to-day work?
In my day-to-day work, data is critically important for telling stories. I think that is important because one of my key roles, now I'm not a technologist, I'm not a scientist. One of my key roles is about awareness raising and trying to translate what I understand the scientists to be saying, into language that policymakers and businesses can understand. It's also critically important for analyzing problems, and the situation. There's an enormous challenge with just modeling and monitoring what's going on up in space. We can't actually see the whole space population with today's technologies. So analyzing just how big the risk of collisions are, analyzing and forecasting what the sun may do at what point in time, that requires a huge amount of crunching of historical data and a lot of assumptions. And then, obviously, I do a lot of coaching and mentoring of startups. That's another thing. I work with a lot of entrepreneurs and, and charities, I should say, trying to help them figure out, how do you monitor your performance? How do you know whether you're achieving your objectives? How do you measure your impact? What is a good way of keeping track of the outcome you're trying to achieve in the world? How do you use feedback loops and information and data to learn and improve and pivot if that's where the market is telling an entrepreneur to go? All of those things are critically important, data-driven tools and techniques that people need to use in my work, in advising people.
And what kind of challenges do you face in making sure that the data that you and your teams are working with is useful to you? I mean, I'm talking about ensuring it's clean and intact and usable so that you can get genuine insight out of it. What kind of challenges do you face?
Well, I mean, again, I go back to, I'm not a technologist, but I certainly have worked with large data sets over my career. And, there were two really big challenges I would describe from my time at the Department of Work and Pensions, for instance, where I worked as the director of customer insight there. We had huge data sets, longitudinal surveys, all of the benefits system data held in all of those systems. And I would say 600 analysts to crunch that data. But what we didn't have, I felt, was a lot of tools and techniques that we could use for extracting actionable insights from the data. It was almost just this historical look back of what has happened. And while that's important, it's not a good predictor of how people will behave in the future. And so I built a team there at GWP that was able to bring what I think is really important, more qualitative data into the way the department analyzed data. Because in a sense, we were awash with data, but it was hard to see what the actionable insights were from that. So it wasn't so much about data cleansing and deduplicating and all of those issues. Those are important issues. It was almost more, if you gather certain data, then if you've always asked the same questions, those are the data points that you'll have back, right? So what we did as a pretty big project was to gather qualitative data. We did customer journey mapping. We did focus group interviews. We created some persona. We used, what historically would be considered marketing tools and techniques to identify who were these people that the department was trying to influence. Why would you have a 28-year-old who came from a household with 3 generations of worklessness in it? What was that 28-year-old story? And we then mapped all the quantitative longitudinal stuff on geographically and in terms of, just statistical analysis and the economics data that we held on all of those data sets. We mapped that together and we're able to extract quite a rich picture of the DWP customer base. And then we walked the board and the senior leadership of the department physically through a space that displayed those stories. Instead of just producing a 5,000-page report full of numbers and pictures, we did that. And it opened up a new conversation, some real kind of aha moments. So I suppose, there is this problem of having huge amounts of data. How can you trust it, et cetera? But I think there's also this problem of being overly reliant on the quantitative data sets. And I think you do need to try and find ways of mapping in qualitative information in order to extract those rich insights. That's my bias anyway. So.
I think what you described there is a fascinating exercise, and the use of customer journey mapping and Persona, and then actually, it almost sounds like you've created a gallery or a world through which you walk your senior colleagues. I think that sounds fascinating. I mean, for me, I'm a sort of insight hound. I think that the word is particularly in the research community and particularly in marketing services, not exclusively. I think also in many government departments and. Maybe it's across the board, but the word, it can be used like confetti. It can be just kind of tossed around like confetti. People say we've got literally millions of insights about. I said, well, I probably think it's down. You might have millions of data points, but if you've got more than a handful of insights, I'd be surprised. I mean, I always like to talk about it being a profound and useful understanding. It's profound because it lets us say, so what do these data mean, and then now what? As you've described very, very eloquently there. Now what should we do as a result? Thinking about the work that you do in looking at these seemingly intractable, but I'm sure they're not, these seemingly intractable problems in space and sustainability in space, are you adopting a similar technique to get to insight from the data that you're working with, as you explained at the DWP?
Yeah, I mean, my role with chairing the network is more about forging partnerships and new collaborations and lobbying and campaigning, trying to persuade government that actually this is an area that merits quite a lot of focus of attention and funding. What I do see happening, and thank goodness, is some very interesting collaborations taking place and some interesting startups trying to do a couple of things to tackle the problem. One is to gather new data. And that's through, for instance, looking at radio frequency. Every satellite up there has to be, controlled from the ground at the moment. This is the way we do it, with radio frequency signals to exchange, command and control information. But actually, you can also read the interruptions in the radio frequencies, and you can gather kind of the exceptions, as it were, instead of where things are going right, and use that to map things. One of the I'll give you two examples of people who are also doing really interesting and innovative things. So at Warwick University, there's a Space Domain Awareness Center of Excellence. And what they've done is they've taken their not radio astronomy, sorry, I'm going to use the wrong words, optical astronomy. They've got big telescopes and, parts of the British, ex-imperial areas where you can see the night sky easily. And they're looking for the non-man-made objects, but they've developed an algorithm that parses the data of the man-made objects out because it's getting in the way of their observations. And then they realize that actually there's value in that data. Those anomalies that are not actually what they want to see, but they can't avoid seeing them, are very useful information if you are trying to map the man-made night sky. And so they have set up this center of expertise at Warwick University to do just that, to take, what were the kind of offcuts of what they were, where they were trying to solve a problem that was getting in the way of astronomy, and instead turn that around as a solution so that satellite operators and astronomers can coexist, more happily together. There's also a startup that I think, I hope they succeed, is a company called Privateer out of Maui in Hawaii. And the founders of that are Alex Fielding and Steve Jobs. Those of us who are old enough will recognize who Steve Jobs is, co-founder of Apple Computers, and Dr. Marie Bajaj, who is a, very inspirational space environmentalist and astrodynamicist out of Austin, Texas. They launched this to do the Google Maps of space. Okay. And they have a really interesting business model, which is all about saying to other satellite operators, just give us your data. We will anonymize it. We will map it into this huge, melting pot. And we will then publish the sort of true map of where things are and how they're moving and, what their behaviors are. And they also have future plans to launch sensors into space where they will do the Google streetcar thing of just mapping bits of the orbital capacity where there's just not enough information to know what's going on. And they're doing that because there's value in the insights that they can generate. They're entrepreneurs, they're serial entrepreneurs.
Sure.
They're not doing it just as a free public good. They're giving free monitoring of your satellite back to operators and researchers and students who are launching their own small satellites nowadays, but they are also recognizing that there's a huge value in being able to extract actionable insights from that massive data set. And that will be a revenue generator for them in the future. So really, I'm not a shareholder. They're privately funded. So I just think what they're doing is very interesting. And it's partly a mission-driven approach of we have to do this to save ourselves. I'm with them, by the way. I do think if we don't get a grip on space traffic management up there, how we share the space in space, we could any day face a scenario where there's a large enough collision of unmanageable objects in the wrong place moving too quickly that would cause a chain reaction that could take all of the satellite infrastructure out. And that will turn our lives back to the way we lived them in the 1950s.
Wow.
The internet, stock exchanges, ATM machines, ambulances, your food delivery during lockdown, you name it. It all depends on satellite data for your everyday life, and if we allow that situation to happen, we will have sleepwalked ourselves into a disaster that will take 200 years to naturally clean itself up, generations. So all power to them and all the other startups that are putting their muscle behind trying to find solutions to that.
You talk about storytelling, and as you know, I'm a great advocate of the human and the empathetic blending together of narrative and numbers. What's the best way you think of bringing those two worlds together? And maybe you can, despite reeling off an array of very clear and very well remembered numbers to us earlier, about 130 million pieces of debris, about 17,600 miles an hour. You mentioned before we started talking that you feel that numbers go in and go out. So first of all, what do you think the best way of joining them is in together? And do you really forget numbers?
I do. I have to write them down. I'll tell you. So I think the best way to join numbers and stories together is to have a few numbers that tell the story, that illustrate the story. I love graphical representations of numbers. I'm not, that's not my forte, but I love when you see those things on, Twitter, and somebody has taken all the historical data and just brought to life whatever it is, the warming of the Earth's atmosphere or whatever, and you can just watch it happening in real time. What I do is I'll tell you a story full of numbers just to illustrate. So I do talks to schools. I do talks about space junk. I do talks to primary school children to say, you guys are going to have to solve the problem that the grown-ups have caused, right? So, and one of the things that I talk about, a story I tell to try and get people interested in space, just as a topic, is to ask this question of, do you think we're alone? Now, the numbers in space are massive, huge numbers, and I can't retain them in my head, so I write them down. And so I say, this is what scientists estimate, right? There are about 2 trillion galaxies in the observable universe. An average of 100 billion stars in each galaxy means that there are about 200 billion trillion stars. And that is a 2 followed by 21 zeros. And when you write that number on a slide or a blackboard, and you just go 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, you know, the kids just think, that is a lot. That's just huge, massive, huge. So if that's how many stars there are, and scientists estimate that every 5th star, 20% of those, has at least one planet orbiting in it in something called the Goldilocks zone. Scientists actually use this terminology. The Goldilocks zone, as you might imagine, is not too close to their sun to be too hot to support life, and not too far away to be too cold. Earth is in the Goldilocks zone of our star. And the question, this actually, Fermi was an astronomer, asked this question many, many centuries ago. The paradox, the Fermi paradox, if there are that many suns like our suns out there, and that many potentially Earth-like planets out there, in the billions of trillions we're talking about, where is everybody? So it's not really a question of when we are discovered by other forms of intelligent life, or we discover them. It's not a question of if, it's a question of when. It's a question of when. And if you put all those zeros down, the kids can kind of, you know, both relate to, oh, I might not be the only kid on this planet and the only planet with life on it in this universe, but it's really, really big space. So, you know, I think if you use some eye-catching numbers to make your point, then you can, you know, it's a memorable thing. They might go home that night and write down that number for their parents and say, this is how many stars there are, and at least 1 in every 5 of those could have an Earth-like planet orbiting around it.
Very good. Brings it together to life beautifully. I'm a big fan of, partly because of my age and partly because I think it's such a good question, of the Columbo question. Is there anything I haven't asked you about the work that you do and the way that you work with data that I should have done?
No, but I suppose that's something that I would like to say, is that because I'm not really a quantitative person, I do have to write down numbers and dates. I don't retain quantitative data very well. I am a big believer that actually you have to interrogate data, and you have to also trust judgment and instinct. So I do know people who, you know, say, well, the model says, you know, this, or, you know, here's our dashboard reporting and we've gathered all the performance data. And yet, you know, that's the data is telling you one thing, but your real life perception of how things are going is telling you something else. Then you have to interrogate the data and say, are we asking the wrong questions? Are we gathering the wrong data? You know, or you have to also just be able to trust your gut a bit. I think, you know, I'll give you one last space story if there's time, you know, to illustrate that, which is, have you heard of Steve Bales?
No, tell me more.
Steve Bales, have you heard of Apollo 11?
I have.
Heard of that mission?
I have.
Steve Bales was a 28-year-old guidance officer in ground control at the time that the moon landing module was approaching the moon. So he was on duty, and they had run thousands of simulations of the whole mission, obviously, but definitely the landing, thousands of simulations. And what happened in those last few minutes, what happened was the computer systems overheated. The telemetry data they were getting back didn't make sense. They had to decide whether to tell the astronauts that they didn't actually know what was going on. And the last piece of information that they had indicated that they were running out of fuel. And so Steve Bales, at 28 years old, had read all the simulations. He had been through all the risk and modeling, and he had to make the call whether to go for landing. The one thing they hadn't simulated was Neil Armstrong taking the autopilot off, switching it off, nice old-fashioned Bakelite switch, because he wanted to land it himself, because he didn't like the look of the initial landing site. Too many boulders. And it was Steve Bales' decision. He was the guy who made the call, go for landing. He could have said, abort. I don't think you're going to have enough fuel. But he thought, okay, we've looked at all these risk scenarios, and he said, go for landing. And they landed with 30 seconds of fuel left.
Wow.
But that was two people making a judgment call. Neil Armstrong, who may have been more predictable. If you were a behavioral economist, whatever, you might have thought, test pilot, you're going to put him up there and then tell him that he can't drive the ship, right? That he has to just let the computer do it. And so he was probably looking for any reason to switch the autopilot off, right? But anyway, we'll never know. But the computers did malfunction, and he did switch it off. And he deemed that it was safer for him to land it manually. And this 28-year-old on the ground deemed that, having absorbed all the scenarios, none of which mapped exactly precisely onto this actual real-life scenario, he could make the judgment call that it was going to be okay.
Brilliant. What a fantastic story. Have you got an example of a misuse of data that you've observed in your career, either in your career or more broadly in the public domain? A favorite misuse of data?
Well, I mean, you might hear from the accent that I'm a dual national, and I'm sure that anybody who asks this question who has any relationship with the United States will talk about the election, of 2021, because, this was a president who refused to believe what the data was telling him. And when you're in that position, don't presume that the numbers are lying, right? Or, presume that actually you need to interrogate that and understand, well, why could that be? Why am I not getting the answer I expected? Instead, he presumed that the numbers were wrong. And he went out in public and encouraged all his followers to believe that the numbers were wrong. And that led to one of the most serious incidents in the history of the United States in terms of putting our democracy in jeopardy, the storming of the Capitol, and, calls for the vice president to be killed. And we've never recovered. I hope we have a strong enough democracy in the U.S. to recover. But that was one man who just didn't want to believe what the numbers were telling him. I think that's a terrible example.
It is terrible and terrifying, and we will be watching across the pond with great interest. We will see, but no, that's a great example. Do you have any questions for me? You don't have to have any questions for me, but after our conversation, do you have any questions for me?
Yeah, I want to know how you got into data storytelling as your career.
Very, very. I'll be as brief as I can. It's a good question. I was badly taught mathematics at school, so I became a classicist, and I fell in love with story and storytelling. And then, after about a dozen years of working in communications agencies, applying the ancient approaches of Aristotle in particular, the beginning and the middle and the end, on behalf of corporate and brand and public health clients. I got an itch to scratch around psychology, went back to school at the University of Sussex, and found a new language, not just story and Latin and Greek and English, but a new language of statistics that I suddenly realized about 11, 12 years ago, as data was getting more and more important with Twitter, Facebook, and in marketing services, but also more broadly in business. As data got more important, I was a bit of people could say, "Oh, look, he can deal with that." So I was a bit of a data hound, And when I created my own business just under a decade ago, I discovered that whilst there were lots and lots and lots of people doing brilliant data visualization, for which, like you, I've got huge amounts of respect for people like David McCandless, the Information is Beautiful guy, and Hans Rosling, the sadly no longer around brilliant epidemiologist. I appreciate it, but I'm not a creative visual person. For me, very much as you've been saying, Katherine, if you don't get the narrative right, any amount of beautiful data visualizations really can kind of go hang. And I don't mean that rudely to data visualizers, but if you don't know what the numbers are telling you, then don't try and dress it up with Tableau or Power BI or anything else. So it was a complete accident. But when I saw that there was a connection, or when I saw that there was another way of appealing particularly to the emotional and the rational side of our, if we make our decisions emotionally and maybe like Steve, you were just talking about in the landing, but based on that rational numerical underpinning, if we can appeal to both those sides of our brains, then I think we stand a better chance of being more persuasive and powerful in our communication. And you're looking in your storytelling around sustainability in space to influence what policymakers are doing for the long-term good of the sustainability of space. I think that is best done with a combination of the two. So that's how I accidentally stumbled into it. But thank you for asking. Very kind.
Well, there you go. You were bitten by the data bug, just like I was bitten by the space bug.
Absolutely was. But I was really disappointed. The day that we're recording is the second day in the south of England, even the far south of England, that the northern lights have apparently been visible. I was so disappointed to see how cloudy it was last night.
Yeah,
not
me
to see
too.
the green over the sky.
I looked and looked, but no luck.
No. Finally, where can our listeners, our viewers, find out about you online? What you're up to online? Is Twitter the place? Is it LinkedIn? Just to tell us where we can find you.
Yes, I'm on LinkedIn. I'm on Twitter, and if you are interested in getting involved in space sustainability, the Global Network on Sustainability in Space has a website as well. But you can also find that organization on Twitter and LinkedIn. Yeah.
Very good. We will include links to all of that in the show notes, so listeners, viewers can find you very straightforwardly. Katherine, thank you so much for making the time to talk to us today. Massively appreciated. Brilliant data-driven storytelling. I think it's fair to say if there were more people like you in this world, there would be less data malarkey and much more data common sense. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for listening to Data Malarkey, the podcast about using data smarter. To find out what kind of data storyteller you are, why not take our data storytelling scorecard? It takes just 2 minutes to complete and will give you a personalized report right away. Visit data-storytelling.scoreapp.com or follow the link in the show notes.